Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction, Erin. I'm very pleased to join and I appreciate being invited and appreciate all of you tuning in. It's actually snowing here in Denver, so it feels great to be sharing a cozy evening together. So what I'm going to do is give some background on 30 by 30, and I'll also share a few films produced by the Center for Western Priorities, and then I look forward to a discussion. Let me start by introducing myself a little bit. The photo on this page is me during a film shoot in the Greater Hart Sheldon. So that could be in the backyard for some of you in Southeast Oregon. And you can go ahead and roll your eyes about my exaggerated response to the howling wind across the sagebrush. I thought it was freezing, so I might be wearing 20 or so layers there. But anyway, I was born and raised in Colorado, went to school here. I started my career working for former Colorado Senator Mark Udall on his Senate campaign in 2008. And then after he won, I wanted to see what governing was like, which it turns out is very different from campaigning. So I moved to DC in 2009, worked for the senator for a few years in different capacities before joining the Obama administration as a political appointee at the Interior Department just at the end of the first term. I'm currently the Director of Campaigns and Special Projects at the Center for Western Priorities. And as I said, I'm based here in Denver. I lived in DC for 8 years, and while I valued my experience there, I often felt like a part of me was missing. And so I felt a profound sense of relief when I returned home to Colorado in 2017. And the reason I want to share this is because I want to respectfully acknowledge the original caretakers of this area, and which in Denver includes the Apache, Ute, Cheyenne, Comanche, and Arapaho. And I like to keep this in mind and consider what a privilege it is to live here and work on these issues, while also acknowledging that there's still a long way to go to heal some historical wounds. So I invite you to join me in holding that space. So let me share a little bit of background about the Center for Western Priorities, or CWP for short. We've been around about 10 years and we're primarily focused on the Rocky Mountain West. So that includes 8 states, the Four Corners region of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, as well as Wyoming, Nevada, Montana, and Idaho. As Erin mentioned, we're a nonpartisan advocacy organization. We are primarily focused on public lands conservation, which includes advocating for responsible energy practices. I mentioned accountability. What I mean here is that we are watching elected officials and agencies at all levels of government for how they respond and craft policy around public lands. We're a communications advocacy organization. So our goal is to drive a positive media narrative around public lands. And we do that through various social media channels, including Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we also have a podcast, The Landscape. We do some original polling and research and policy analysis as well. So let's talk about what 30 by 30 is. 30 by 30 is essentially shorthand for the goal of protecting 30% of America's lands and waters by 2030. And I want to come right out and say that those numbers aren't coming out of thin air. This is what leading scientists tell us is necessary to protect biodiversity and prevent a climate catastrophe. There have been a number of champions in Congress and on the campaign trail for the 30 by 30 goal. And we'll hear from one of them in a minute, but we're fortunate that shortly after being sworn into office, President Biden signed an executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, which calls for a report to the National Climate Task Force recommending steps for reaching the 30 by 30 goal. The executive order also stipulated listening to and working with tribes, state and local governments, and other stakeholders. So the result of that executive order is the Conserving and Restoring America the Beautiful report, which calls for the creation of a conservation and stewardship atlas to collect baseline info about what is already protected and how it's being measured, how to measure progress going forward. And for those who may not be aware, we've already conserved around 12% of land in this country. The report also contains 8 principles that are helpful guidelines for how to approach this work on the ground, including pursuing a collaborative and inclusive approach to conservation, supporting locally led conservation efforts, honoring tribal sovereignty and supporting the priorities of tribal nations, pursuing conservation and restoration approaches that create jobs and support healthy communities, honoring private property rights and supporting voluntary stewardship efforts of private landowners, and using science as a guide. I'll mention quickly that the Center for Western Priorities has produced a series of interactive story maps looking at all the different ways of reaching the 30 by 30 goal. So this includes national wildlife refuges, national monuments, state parks, wildlife corridors, urban parks. There's, I think, about 10 in the collection. Part of why we did this is it's our belief that 30 by 30 will look different in different communities on the ground. It's certainly not one size fits all. So now that I've shared the background and context, I'd like to show a short 4-minute animated film featuring former New Mexico Senator Tom Udall and National Geographic Explorer in Residence, Dr. Enrique Sala. They're going to delve further into the science behind the 30 by 30 goal and the dual biodiversity and climate crises we're facing and the urgency of achieving the 30 by 30 goal. So let me stop sharing this slideshow for a second and I will get us to the film.
My name is Enrique Sala, and I am National Geographic Explorer in Residence. I work to save wild places, to restore the richness and productivity of our natural world.
I'm Senator Tom Udall from New Mexico. I'm the author of the 30 by 30 resolution to save nature.
We have transformed half of the inhabitable land, cutting forests for farms, grazing, and cities.
We're losing a football field's worth of nature every 30 seconds.
We have replaced wildlife with our domesticated livestock. We have killed 90% of the large fish in the ocean.
People have already heard a lot about the threat posed by climate change, but we hear less about the nature crisis. The truth is, we have to solve one to solve the other. They can't be separated.
We've been able to see the decline of nature around us because of the work of thousands of scientists working across the world over many years, collecting data on everything from temperature to abundance of species.
We're in the middle of a 6th mass extinction. Human beings continue to destroy nature at a devastating rate.
Between our assault on biodiversity and global warming, we are destroying our life support system.
Humanity is deeply reliant on Mother Nature for our way of life. The extinction of one species has profound ripple effects that can alter industries, economies, global health, and security. Imagine a world without bees to pollinate crops or fungi to derive new life-saving medicines from.
There is nothing more urgent, in my opinion.
Scientists like Dr. Sala tell us we need to protect 30% of the land and water by 2030 and continue at that pace to save nature.
If we don't meet this goal by the end of the decade, it's going to be too late. Everything that we will not preserve by 2030 probably will be lost forever.
I don't mean to be an alarmist, but being bold is really our only option. I've introduced a bill in the Senate. It's called the 30 by 30 resolution to save nature. It sets a goal for the nation of protecting 30% of our land and water by 2030, with half protected by mid-century. Then there are a variety of policies we can undertake to achieve that goal. New national monuments, wilderness areas, and other protections. Establishing wildlife corridors. These corridors will protect biodiversity and species habitat. reforestation efforts. 30 by 30 is about protecting the best and also restoring the rest.
The good news is that when we give nature space, she can bounce back spectacularly and continue providing for us. I have seen places in the ocean that were degraded, that were dead, come back in just a few years after protecting them from our activities.
The only way we'll get there is if the American people continue to organize like they have been, to show their leaders that they won't accept anything less than bold action to save our planet.
Nature is much more resilient than we think. Nature has this spectacular ability to bounce back if we just give her a little space.
If we get to 30 by 30, we can save our planet and make sure our children have a livable world. We can live in better harmony with nature, because protecting the planet at the end of the day means protecting humanity.
Awesome. Let me just switch back to my PowerPoint. So one of the things I like about that film is that it makes the point that we need to protect nature to protect humanity, and also that nature can recover when given the opportunity. It seems that optimism is necessary for an audacious endeavor like this. So now that I've shared the background on 30 by 30, I'll tell you a little bit about CWP's Postcards campaign. It seemed to us that we needed to personalize this big amorphous goal and show what it could look like on the ground and perhaps make it a little more real. So we are highlighting the people behind efforts to protect special places across the country, and also showing examples of the different ways of meeting the 30 by 30 goal. So far we've looked at national monument proposals, conservation easements on private land, and administrative protections as well. It's a multimedia campaign, so it's not just one type of story that we're sharing. We produce some documentary style films, podcasts, interactive story maps, and blogs. So I'd like to share an example of one of the postcards we produced that's actually in your own backyard in Oregon. We spoke to two former U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service officials and a former large animal veterinarian and member of the Friends of Heart Mountain about the greater Hart-Sheldon region in Southeast Oregon and Northern Nevada. So let's watch and hear from them about why this place is so special.
The greater Hart-Sheldon is unique because it's some of the last best remaining sagebrush steppe that we have in the United States.
One of the things that makes it really unique and special is that we still have this vast, wide open place with pronghorn and sage-grouse that you really can't find anywhere else in the world. There's no other place that's ever going to be like it.
When people look here at the sagebrush seed, they sometimes just see a monoculture of sagebrush. And what they don't see is that it's really diverse and it's really intricate, and it provides amazing habitat for hundreds of species that depend upon it.
I've come to realize that much more than individual species, it's about whole systems. This is the kind of place where you can literally envision an entire ecosystem. And by ecosystem, I mean all the plants and animals in this area and the means to sustain them.
As we lose sagebrush across other parts of the West, this area is going to become even more important as far as maintaining this habitat type into the future. When I worked here at the refuges, I conducted a study in 2011 to 2013 where we colored pronghorn with GPS collars. Some of the things that we learned during that study is that we do still have some long-distance migration going on here in the greater Hart-Sheldon area, and long-distance ungulate migrations are something that we're losing here in North America.
Back when Hart Mountain Refuge and Sheldon Refuge were first proposed, they were actually part of a much bigger proposal that included almost twice the total acreage of the two refuges today. And it turns out that that is exactly the ecosystem expansion that the pronghorn need. And that's not included in a protected status today.
You can't help but fall in love with this place, and you want to share that with people.
I'm not alone out here because out here I'm connected to all the history that made this place. I'm benefiting so much from the examples set by the animals in this environment. I owe it to them to try to help keep this ecosystem intact enough that they can survive here.
If we were to lose this place, this landscape, it would just be a tragedy because it's not broken. We have the opportunity to keep it intact and unbroken. And that's really what we're trying to protect.
Moving forward, if we can make sure to preserve this for future generations, we're going to be doing a really great thing.
Awesome. Let me just check here. Make sure I haven't missed anything in the chat. Make sure folks can hear well. All right. So I'll get back to my PowerPoint and then I'll back up and share a little bit about how that film in particular came together. So last July, I reached out to the Oregon Natural Desert Association and I asked if we could feature this area and if they knew anyone who would be willing to speak on camera that has a personal connection to this place. So once we identified our 3 speakers, we did a pre-interview over Zoom to learn more about each of them, why they love this place, why it deserves to be protected. And I should mention that we hired a cinematographer from LA. His name is AJ Carter, and he's with the Metropolis Media Group. We could not have done this film or any of the others without his skill and expertise. And I want folks to know that we were thoughtful about getting drone permits. We did so when we needed to and didn't film in areas where we couldn't. And I understand there are reservations around drones, but it's really hard to imagine how you would capture the scale of a place like this without that capability. And we actually became very attached to our drone in the course of filming 5 of these. We named it Buzz, and we loved it like a companion. We actually almost lost it in Southern Nevada, and we were all screaming, "Buzz, come back!" So honorable mention to Buzz the drone. In addition to the Hart-Sheldon film, we've produced 9 other postcards, and I've listed them here so you can see both the geographic breadth and the different types of conservation featured. So as you can see, we've looked at large landscapes, including the Bears Ears National Monument, the Aviquame National Monument proposal in Southern Nevada, the Chumash Marine Heritage Sanctuary proposal. We've also looked at conservation in urban areas, including the Kastner Range in El Paso. It's a former bombing range that is right next to the Franklin Mountains in El Paso, which is one of the largest urban areas in the country. We also talked to some folks who manage the Valle de Oro National Wildlife Refuge in Albuquerque, which used to be a dairy before becoming a wildlife refuge. And then we've talked to folks about private conservation. We visited a family cattle ranch in Steamboat, Colorado this fall, where we met with Jay Fetcher to talk about how conservation easements have benefited him and his family. And then we've looked at other philanthropic and administrative efforts as well. I want to highlight a few Indigenous-led efforts we featured. So I'm going to share a brief 4-minute compilation now.
My name is Regina Lopez White Skunk. I'm a former elected official for the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe. I'm also a former co-chair of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. What I feel when I come out here is like I come home. There's a connection. It's like I come to visit a relative. When the tribal leaders came together, one of the visions that we had was that this could serve as a model for other Indigenous-led endeavors to protect sacred sites and landscapes. When the monument was reduced 85% by President Trump, I was heartbroken. I still feel very emotional when I speak about this because of how much I tried to elevate the voices of my people.
Vikwayame means Spirit Mountain. This area is important to us because it's who we are. The beginning, the Garden of Eden.
This particular area here at Grapevine Canyon, we have thousands of petroglyphs on the cliffs and the walls here that were, put here by our people, our ancestors. There's people that come here and try to chisel off portions of the rock writing that exists out in this area. We've had vandalism where people came and paintballed the whole area. When I come here, I feel such a relief. I feel a connection. My spirit is renewed. And it's everything. It is me. I am the mountain.
We're standing in front of part of what would be the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. It would close the gap between the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary and the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary and ban offshore oil, natural gas extraction, seismic testing, and pollution off the waters of our coasts. This is the first tribally led nominated marine sanctuary put forth by a coalition of like-minded NGOs, environmental activists, and tribal communities.
The Chumash have been the stewards and guardians since time immemorial by Western archaeology, approximately 20,000 years. The amazing thing about this movement is that we have come from a very small, under-resourced community, grassroots movement, and we have been working hand in hand with the Chumash tribe.
The Chumash people are ocean-going people. We lived by the ocean. It sustained us through food and through trade and through ceremony. One of our sacred places here for the Chumash people is what we call Liisa Mu, and that's Morro Rock. It's one of the sacred places for our people to journey, to pray for solstice ceremony, for winter and summer solstice ceremony. If the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary is designated, it would provide increased protection for some of our most significant keystone species. The southern sea otter, which makes its home over by Morro Rock, is one of the main species that will benefit from the sanctuary. All the whales, all the marine invertebrates. You'll see the great pelicans here. You'll see the snowy egrets and the blue herons.
Awesome. So I wanted to share those excerpts partly in recognition of one of the principles of the America the Beautiful report to honor sovereignty of tribal nations and support their priorities. So I felt incredibly honored to visit these places and learn why they are sacred and in need of protection. Part of the reason we launched the Postcards campaign was to provide examples of locally driven conservation efforts that are already underway across the country, and to encourage the Biden administration to use the tools it has available to take action and support these efforts administratively, and to do so sooner rather than later. As folks may know, it takes time to submit proposals for a nomination, to host public meetings and comment periods, to gather tribal and stakeholder input. And many of the individuals and organizations we've spoken with so far as part of this campaign have been working for decades to achieve protection. And it's evident now that that's time we don't have. So our hope is to show demand and also support for conservation efforts on the ground, which is something we'll continue to do through these and other films, and through ads actually calling on the Biden administration directly. So I'll play a quick 30-second ad where we do that.
Every generation contributes to America's greatest idea, that public lands are ours, that what we protect, what we commemorate, and what we share defines us. Now President Biden can define our legacy, protecting places that matter and fulfilling a bold new conservation vision driven by the people. America is ready.
So folks may have seen we snuck a Waihe Canyon lands in there. So that's all I have to share right now, but I want to thank all of you again for tuning in this evening, and I'm looking forward to hearing about Oregon Wild's efforts to engage on 30 by 30, and I also look forward to taking your questions. So I'll turn it over to Chandra.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was awesome. And yeah, just a reminder to folks, if you do have questions about this whole thing, or for Lauren or for me eventually, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A, and we will get to those in the last 10 or 15 minutes of the evening. So I'm going to also share a slideshow. Okay. Well, my name's Chandra Legui. I work for Oregon Wild in our Forest and Wildlands campaigns out of our Eugene office. And and I live in the homelands of the Kalapuya people. I really do want to thank Lauren again for that great perspective on how the 30 by 30 vision could be accomplished for the Western United States. It's a huge landscape and so much potential. And it's really exciting to think about how Oregon can play into that grand vision. And it was great to see a story from part of our state. So thank you for sharing that. So establishing more meaningful conservation protections for Oregon's lands and waters under the 30 by 30 initiative absolutely aligns with Oregon Wild's values and our goals as an organization. We see 30 by 30 as a win-win that will help us mitigate for and adapt to the impacts of climate change, aid in protecting wildlife habitat and the connections they need, and benefit communities in the form of protected water sources, fire resiliency, and quality of life. And as was touched on in Lauren's video, we also would love to see this effort lead to supporting and empowering tribal entities in ways that recognize their sovereignty and rights and improve access to cultural resources on public lands. So while this global 30 by 30 campaign and the United States commitment to it are relatively new, Oregon Wild has been essentially working towards this goal throughout our history. We've been working to protect wilderness areas, wild roadless lands, wild and scenic rivers, national monuments, and old growth forests for decades. Our ongoing campaigns in support of forest and wildlife habitat restoration, protecting mature and old growth forests, and adding streams to the wild and scenic rivers network can make major contributions to the 30 by 30 goal. So that's what I'm going to focus on in a few minutes here. So let me give you a few examples. Let me advance. First, let me say that while there's definitely a place for incentive and voluntary initiatives to increase conservation on privately owned lands across the country, some of those initiatives are laid out in Biden's America the Beautiful report. It really is public lands that offer the best opportunities to truly protect 30% of our nation's land and waters. And that's the focus that Center for Western Priorities has, and Oregon Wilds as well. So in Oregon, public lands make up about half the state. And so just a simple map here to show those areas that are mostly managed by the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service, as well as Fish and Wildlife and the National Park System. Now, there are already some good protections for a lot of public lands, but only about 10% of Oregon's lands meet the highest standards of protection as defined by the U.S. Geological Survey, or USGS. So I'm going to linger on that point for a moment. So the USGS defines protection levels as GAP 1, 2, and 3. Sorry, GAP 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I actually don't know what GAP stands for, but they define them. And only GAP 1 and 2 actually meet the level of conservation protection that really meets the intent of the global scientific community's call for action on 30 by 30. And I've got the definitions up here from the USGS. But essentially, GAP 1 and 2 means that areas have mandated management plans that protect biodiversity and natural processes. And so we feel that as the Biden administration works to identify areas that help meet the 30 by 30 goal, we really should be focusing on these high standards. So on this map of showing GAP 1 and 2 areas, GAP 1 is in the darkest green, and the sort of olive green are the GAP 2 areas with slightly less protection. And you can see, if you're familiar with the map of Oregon, that most of the areas that qualify as GAP 1 are wilderness areas, and GAP 2 includes things like wild and scenic river corridors, national wildlife refuges, and a few other categories of wilderness study areas, for example, out in the desert side of the state. I'm just going to zoom in here for a second. Almost all of the GAP 1 and 2 lands in Oregon are on federal public lands. And as I said, mostly in designated wilderness, national parks, national monuments, and wild and scenic river corridors. And here's a close-up of southwestern Oregon, just because it gave a good variety of different categories. So there's wilderness areas, there's wild and scenic river corridors, there's the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument, there's our one and only national park, Crater Lake, And you can see part of one of the Klamath wildlife refuges there too, that all meet these high standards for management and preservation of nature. So these are some of Oregon's most special places. They're rich in biodiversity, water quality, carbon storage, and cultural resources. But many other important lands from the perspective of protecting and restoring biodiversity, habitat connectivity, and carbon storage are still not protected to meet this high level standard. And so we feel it's really vital that more lands gain these high level of protections. The big question is, how do we get there? And that's partly what Lauren is talking about, is the road to get there. One way of looking at it is of how we determine the most important lands to protect could come from studies, such as one recently published in the journal Nature by Dr. Beverly Law. This is a map from that study. This study lays out a strategic framework based on climate and biodiversity factors and identifies lands under that framework that should be prioritized for protection by 2030 and by 2050 across the West. And many of these priorities overlap with roadless areas and old forests that we've long been working to protect. So that, in essence, this map just shows the current GAP 1 and 2 status areas and then forest carbon resources. And so you can see, hopefully in Oregon, that there's some dark blue areas that are high carbon storage potential areas, but that aren't currently protected under GAP 1 or 2. So it's one way that we could go about it. But there are other ways of identifying appropriate lands, and more importantly, lots of opportunities for both state and federal government to take action to contribute to 30 by 30 in Oregon. And you can find a laundry list of these opportunities that we developed on our website, and I'll make sure that those get sent out in the follow-up to this webinar. But for example, at the state level, the governor and state agencies in Oregon could permanently protect all of the old growth stands in our state forests. So for example, in the Elliott State Forest, where we have some old forests left. Our state agencies could double the size of the state scenic waterway system and add more protections under the outstanding resource waters designation. So these are powers that the state has. On the federal level, on the executive side of things, the Biden administration and federal agencies could designate new and expand existing national monuments. They could issue a rule to protect all remaining mature and old growth forests and trees on federal lands. And I will talk more about that in a moment. They could strengthen protections for inventoried roadless areas so that they qualify for the highest GAP levels. So for example, in Oregon, we have about 2 million acres of inventory roadless areas protected under the roadless rule, but those protections aren't legislated, and so they don't actually count under GAP 1 and 2. There is a piece of legislation that would codify the roadless rule in Congress, and so that's something that we would support. And then they could add more roadless wildlands to the inventory of roadless areas and add protections for them. So that would be another 2 million acres in Oregon. I'm going to show you another map. This shows what we're calling intact forests in Oregon. So forested areas that are over 1,000 acres in size that have never been logged. And so that's kind of a stand-in for mature and old growth forests in many ways. And as you can see, with the green overlap on here, only a portion of these intact forests have that GAP 1 or 2 protection status, and all of the red, these large intact forested areas have a varying levels of protection that don't quite meet that high level standard. And so there's lots of them out there, in essence, across our beautiful state. Another thing that our federal lawmakers could do on the congressional side of things is to pass the River Democracy Act, introduced last year, that would designate over 4,000 miles of new wild and scenic rivers across Oregon with protected buffers, and that would meet the GAP 2 standards. Here's a map of some of the amazing rivers that made it into Senator Wyden's legislation last year in blue, adding to the purple network on this map of existing wild and scenic rivers. The Congress could also pass other legislation like the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act that would better provide habitat connectivity across the landscape. And then there's the opportunity to designate new or expand on wilderness areas, which is something that we've been supporting across Oregon for many years. And some areas have campaigns already in the works, such as around Mount Hood, expanding the Wild Rogue Wilderness, expanding wilderness protections around Waldo Lake, expanding desert wilderness areas such as the Greater Hart-Sheldon area and Oahe Canyon lands, and a campaign that's been going on in the background for many years, the Crater Lake Wilderness, which includes connections from Diamond Peak through the Southern Cascades into the North Umpqua and Upper Rogue River areas, with our only national park at its heart. But this this amazing area, rich in biodiversity and an amazing wildlife corridor, still lacks a lot of the protections that we feel it deserves. So there's great opportunity for adding additional wilderness at the highest level. So in short, we believe that Oregon's spectacular wildlands, forests, and waters can play a major role in accomplishing the 30 by 30 goal to address the dual biodiversity and climate crises facing our global ecosystems and communities. And Oregon Wild needs your support to ensure this important work gets done. One way of doing that is to help us with our Climate Forest campaign. Launched just yesterday, we are part of a huge movement calling on the Biden administration to protect mature and old growth forests and trees across the nation from logging as a cornerstone of US climate policy. This is our brand new website, climate-forest.org, and you can find out more there and sign up sign the petition to get this done. Another way is to comment on the atlas that Lauren mentioned that's being developed by federal agencies that will identify lands and waters that should be conserved and restored under the 30 by 30 initiative. So we want to make sure that they're using the best science, that they're delineating different areas for conservation in a good way. Oregon Wild sent an alert out yesterday that will help you offer comments if you want to. Those are due March 4th, and we'll make sure to get that alert out to you if you haven't already gotten it. So to end, I just want to thank everyone again for your continued support of Oregon Wild's efforts and for attending tonight. And we have a good 10 minutes or so for Q&A. So let me stop sharing and get back to the list of questions that I've been collecting here. And there are a few that I noted already before I started talking that we can start with. So one of them, which I think is a really important one, is why haven't folks heard about this major initiative on major news outlets? I wonder if you can take that, Lauren.
Oh, sure. Well, let's hope that that changes. As our campaign is showing, this work is happening on the ground, and the fact that it's being locally driven is cause for celebration. I think sometimes it's difficult to cover things that are in process. So it might just be that we need to get some of these proposals and campaigns to a place where there's more of a definitive action taking place. But I also think this is our job in the nonprofit sector. Sometimes it feels like we're beating pots and pans on the sidelines, but it's all of us. It's all of us doing it together, and decision makers pay attention to that. So I'm not discouraged. I'm not deterred yet. I think that it takes time and a lot of voices.
Great, thank you. I could give a more cynical answer, but I won't. Somebody asked about what current threats there are for places like the Hart-Sheldon Reserve, for example, since you featured that. But if you have thoughts on what some of the other threats are to public lands and obtaining some of these protections, that'd be great to hear too.
Sure. And this is one of the questions that we ask when we do those pre-interviews with speakers for the films, or when we've done a podcast or another type of interview, is to ask what happens if we don't act? What happens to this place if greater protections aren't put in place? So speaking specifically about Hart Sheldon, before Gail Collins did her collaring study with pronghorn, it wasn't known the extent to which those animals have fidelity to this particular migration route between Sheldon and Hart refuges. So that's an example of something that, if there isn't greater protection specifically focused on that migration route, that could be lost. So some of those, and I'm not speaking specifically here, I'm not aware of a specific project or proposal or threat, but just emphasizing the necessity to not have barriers along that migration route. You know, there can be natural pinch points, there can be roads, development, competition, either with humans or other animals or livestock. So those are some things that are part of this. I think I'll stop there and see if there's anything you want to add, Chandra.
I don't know that area specifically, but I think it is safe to say that continued, exploitation for resource extraction is in general a threat to many of these special places. Someone asked a question about the proposed lithium mine along the Oregon-Nevada border. There was a story about that today, and I don't know enough details to know, exactly where that is or what the impacts might be, but there's one example, a continued pressure to log some of our last remaining old forests. Thinking about here in my backyard and in Southwest Oregon, that close-up map I showed, there's 1 million acres of old forests that are found on Bureau of Land Management lands in Western Oregon that, many of which are still at risk. And those could be amazing wildlife corridor connections, storing tons of carbon, increasing fire resiliency, but they're under a tremendous amount of pressure to get the cut out. So lots of threats still out there, which is why we need to be working on these proactive campaigns. Someone asked about, and I think this is a wonderful question, how grassroots groups can take a more active role in 30 by 30. And specifically, a few people asked about some of the resources that you've developed at CWP. These videos, do you have plans for adding to them or making them? I think they are pretty available. But any advice for folks who are working on local campaigns to get more involved in this?
It's a great question. And one of the things that I want to say at the top is not to underestimate the power of a compelling personal story. That's really what's driving these postcards. And you can't have that if you're not at the grassroots level, talking to people in a community who have an investment, who have something to lose if a place is not protected. So that's a tremendous advantage in terms of engaging on this work. We have put together a library of resources on our roadto30.org website, and I'll be happy to share in the follow-up email that goes out tomorrow some links to some of those resources. That's something that's really hard to do, original research and analysis, if you're a small kind of bootstrapped organization. So it's nice to take advantage of some of the information that's already out there. We would love it for our films or any of our B-roll to be used. The whiteboard video that I shared at the beginning that gave the background of 30 by 30, that's on our YouTube channel. You're welcome to share it along your social media channels. I also think that op-eds can be a really powerful tool as well. It's if you're working on a designation or proposal for a particular place, it might be a good idea to Google the name of that place and see what content comes up to give you a sense of how and where you want to add additional positive information about that place as well. And I would also say that we're always looking for more stories to tell all over the country, and to please reach out for a brainstorm, or if you know of something else, but certainly we want to be a partner to to groups all over.
Great, yeah. I'm sure some folks will be interested in, connecting after this. So thanks for that. Here's a question about protections for coastal marshlands and estuaries around the country and how important that is, with sea levels rising. And I know in Oregon, we have probably we have pretty decent protections for our beaches and them being public, but good land use laws. But I don't know very much about the rest of the country and protecting those areas.
I wanted to share on that note that when we visited the California Central Coast and we were working on the Chumash Marine Heritage film, one of my favorite parts was encountering you. I don't remember if this was in the clip, but there's an aerial view with a drone of a wetlands area. And you can see the water running right into the ocean. There were egrets, there were herons, there were all kinds of birds in the area. And I think when it comes to something like this, maybe it's a public education opportunity, or it's an opportunity to talk about the science. What are the ecosystem services of wetlands in terms of maybe retention of the shore, of water filtration? I'm a little out of my depth here, to use an apt metaphor, but I think in that case, whatever it is that you want to protect, help people understand why it's important, why it matters to people, why it matters to wildlife, and what happens if you don't act to protect it.
Storytelling, that's the message I'm getting, which is one way your postcards are so great. I think you probably know the answer to this, but somebody asked, does 30 by 30 include rehabilitating high value but degraded lands such as wet meadows, tall grass prairies? I'm going to throw in forests as well.
So one of the 8 principles in the America the Beautiful report, Conserving America the Beautiful, does talk about restoration, which I was really pleased to hear about. Unfortunately, Oregon has seen some catastrophic wildfires in recent years, and some of that can be because of invasive annual grasses, and there is a lot of restoration work to be done in an ecosystem like that. So certainly I believe there are opportunities for that. I'm not aware of as many underway, but I'll also say that President Biden's climate executive order included a call for standing up the Civilian Climate Corps, which could do some of that work if it's comes into being. So I'm excited to see what we can do there, because I just don't know how you can get to 30% without including restoration.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, I was talking about, attaining that highest level of GAP 1 or 2 status. And that doesn't necessarily preclude areas that need to be restored. It just means that their management plans are such that they are designated for preserving natural systems and biodiversity. And so I think restoration can be a part of that. And, not everyone might hold 30 by 30 to those super high standards like we're pushing for, which I think leaves a lot of room for restoration areas. And I think your video explained that, we want to keep going, right? Not just stopping at 30% by 2030, but by mid-century, half the land. That's what a lot of scientists are calling for. And so restored areas are definitely a huge part of that.
Absolutely. And I would even put urban areas in there as well. There's a couple ways to look at this. We can look at the large landscapes and the numbers on the board, but we can also look at the ecological value on a smaller scale, which I think can be fulfilled in some of these smaller parks and urban areas. And with what we've all lived through in the last 2 years and what our recent polling has shown is just how much we need that natural area. I don't know if folks saw the news, but doctors in Canada can now prescribe national park passes. So I think that there's case to be made that conserved areas in your own backyard or in your neighborhood have a tremendous value as well for people and sometimes for urban wildlife too.
Definitely important connections. I think I have one more thing that I think we'll cover before we need to sign off, but this is bringing it back out You just brought it down to, urban areas and parks, but somebody asked about whether our organizations partner with UNESCO, and I don't know the answer for you. Oregon Wild certainly doesn't, but I think I just want to call attention to the fact that this is a global campaign, and many other nations are working on 30 by 30. And I don't know if you have more of an answer to that, but that's my general understanding.
It is a global effort, right? That's another thing that the pandemic taught us, is how we are all sharing air and water and space. And so there's value in protecting areas in your corner of the world, but what if that doesn't connect to other places? So there's definitely a continuum that we'd like to see across the world over. We are not specifically partnered with UNESCO, but it calls to mind to me that some World Heritage sites that we have in this country that are threatened by development, like the Chaco National Historical Park in New Mexico and the oil and gas drilling that's at the doorstep. Luckily, the administration has taken some action there, but I agree. It's a very good point that this has to be a global effort.
Great. Well, I think we are committed here to doing our part. So thank you again, Lauren, for joining us and telling us more about the Road to 30 and sharing your beautiful postcard videos. For those of you listening online, we're going to sign off, but thanks so much for joining us. And Oregon Wild has, I think, a week off, and then 2 more great webcasts coming up in March. So thanks so much, everybody, and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure.
Bye.